Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is Human Biology, chapters 13, 14, and 15, and we are in part C. In part A, we learned about the heart and the parts of the heart and what the heart does. In part B, we learned about blood vessels and blood circulation. We learned about Reggie, and we learned about the different types of blood vessels, like arteries that take blood away and arterioles that are smaller than arteries, and capillaries, which are thin-walled blood vessels that allow for diffusion and the exchange of gases and nutrients, and venules, which are small veins, and veins which take the blood from the body and return it to the heart. And we looked at how the arteries are different than capillaries, which are different than veins, and how arteries are built for their job and they have that nice thick muscular middle part that can constrict or dilate to help with blood pressure. And we learned about the major arteries you need to know: the aorta, the pulmonary artery, the coronary artery. And then we learned about veins and how they are also built for their job. They are thinner walled, and blood moves through them not by the heart pumping, but by your muscles kind of squeezing blood through the veins. And then they also have these valves, so once blood gets squeezed through, it can't go back. And we talked about the veins that you need to know: inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, and the pulmonary vein. We looked at the major ones, and then we were talking about capillaries and how they are built for their job. They're very thin, which allows the diffusion, and we're going to look at a diagram showing how fluids move, which way they move, either out of the capillary or into the capillary. So let's look at that diagram. Okay, so we can see over by the artery, by the arterial, the blood pressure is going to be higher than over here by the venules, by the veins. So the pressure is higher here than here. So just like a leaky water hose, if you have holes in it, the fluid is going to leak out. And that's why fluid goes, so water, dissolved, anything dissolved in it like glucose and oxygen, goes out on this side of the capillaries. But we need that liquid back, or else you would have no blood. How does the liquid go back at the venule side? Well, that is osmotic pressure. So we know that water wants to equalize itself out, so there are more particles and less water here, so the water moves from high to low. And that's how the water gets back into our blood vessels to still be blood, so that we have a good amount of blood. So looking at structure and function, we see the artery, the capillary, and the vein. And how do we control the blood flow? Well, blood flow is controlled by vasodilation, getting bigger, vasoconstriction, getting smaller, and then these things called precapillary sphincters. And we know sphincters are like valves that shut something off, that open or close. So capillaries of essential organs, the brain, the heart, the kidneys, and the liver, are almost always open. So you can see that there are these sphincters here, which means that the blood can go through into that capillary bed and go to all the cells of the brain, the heart, the kidney, the liver. But maybe you are in the small intestine and you don't need blood in all of the small intestine all of the time, mostly when you are digesting a meal. So you just shut it off, and then the blood doesn't go all the time into those capillaries to the cells that are over there. So the capillaries of other tissues are only open when needed. So example, the digestive tract capillaries are open when digesting but closed when you are exercising. because you need the blood and the oxygen and the nutrients to your muscles and heart and lungs and brain then. Well, there you go. That's why. All right, let's talk a little bit more about blood pressure. So that is the force of blood exerted on walls of the blood vessels. So it's literally the pressure of the blood on the walls of the blood vessels. And we're going to talk about systole or systolic pressure. It's the maximum pressure, the measure of the maximum pressure in arteries when the heart contracts. That's going to be the big number, and whenever they give you a blood pressure, it's going to be the one on top. So let's say you go and get your blood pressure taken at the clinic, and it is 120/80. So 120 is the systolic pressure. It is the maximum pressure. So what's going on in the heart when that number shows up? Well, that is the heart contracting. Those are the ventricles pumping blood out. There's another number called diastolic. That is the measure of the lowest pressure in the arteries during cardiac relaxation. So it's your minimum pressure. It's going to be the smaller number, the number on the bottom. Again, that would be 80 if it was 120/80. And what's going on in the heart during that time? Well, that's when the heart is relaxing, so the ventricles aren't pumping. The heart needs to relax so the atria can fill with blood coming back from the body. So normal adult blood pressure is 120/80. It's very likely that you do not have your adult blood pressure yet, that yours would be a little bit lower, maybe 110/70. Hypertension is going to be above that. So that's when your systolic is above 140 or your diastolic is above 90. And let's look at how one takes blood pressure. So normally you have blood flowing through your arteries, and then when you take the blood pressure cuff and they pump it up and it gets tight on your arm, it's actually cutting off the circulation in that artery, in the brachial artery. And then the nurse or whoever is taking blood pressure will listen, and when they start hearing the blood coming through in your stethoscope, they can hear the little whooshing sound, then that is your maximum pressure. And then when they stop hearing the sound, that's your minimum pressure. So you can hear when it starts flowing through, and then you can hear when it is flowing freely. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, let's hear about Reggie and his thrombosis and embolism, and let's talk about that in class. But what I do want you to write down now is thrombosis, and osis is the condition of having a thrombus or a blood clot in a blood vessel. And so why would this be dangerous? So one of the ones we're going to talk about is deep venous thrombosis. It's where you have a blood clot in a deep vein. So not one that's right by the surface of your skin, but one that's kind of like by your trunk or really deep in your body. So a blood clot in a deep vein, it's the most common in veins of the calf muscle. And it is common after surgery, injury, childbirth, after being bedridden. It's more common with obesity. And an embolus is a dangerous complication of thrombosis. And that's where a piece of the blood clot gets loose in the blood and it's floating around. And we know that if it gets stuck somewhere, it could cut off that blood vessel, and then whatever tissues the blood vessel is supplying, they wouldn't be getting oxygen or glucose, and then those cells would die, and that could be really bad. So a pulmonary embolism is when you have an embolus in the lungs, and you could also have it in the heart or the brain. These are all essential organs that it would be bad if you had an embolus there. Because sudden death may occur because you need all of your essential organs to be working. What could we possibly do if you have an embolus? You could take drugs to dissolve the clot. I think they're called antithrombolytic drugs. And prevention would be the best way. So the prevention of infections, doing some activity to promote circulation post-surgery, and then taking some anticoagulant drugs post-surgery. All right, so our last chapter in this unit is Chapter 13, the blood. So we're going to learn about baby Cole in class and his hemoglobin abnormality. Right now, let's talk about the different parts of blood. So blood is a tissue. So we know that from way back in the beginning. It's a type of connective tissue, and it's made out of plasma and blood cells. So if you look at whole blood, and you were to centrifuge it so it would separate into its parts, you would have over half is plasma, and then you would have red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and we're going to learn them by their science names. Let's start off talking about the blood plasma. So plasma is mostly water, 91% water. Also, the other big part of it, 8%, is proteins. So you have some important proteins that are floating around in your blood. You have albumin, and this is important for maintaining your body's osmotic pressure. So we know that osmotic pressure is important because that's what draws the liquid back into your capillaries so that you still have blood, instead of it all just going, all the liquid going out into the tissues. So these act like solutes that will draw the water back in to equalize it. Another protein are your clotting factors, and we know that's really important for blood clots to stop the bleeding. And antibodies, which everybody loves antibodies, they help keep you healthy. And antibodies are actually made by certain white blood cells or leukocytes, and we're going to learn more about that in our immune system chapter. And then all the other things make up 1%. So please write these down: glucose, amino acids, cholesterol, hormones, waste, gases, electrolytes, some important electrolytes, sodium. We know sodium, potassium, and calcium are important. And then carbonate is an important electrolyte, which we'll talk about in this chapter. Not so much in this chapter, but more in the respiratory system chapter. So please write this down, get that out of the way for you. Functions of electrolytes: they buffer the pH of blood, they help in the formation of bone, we know calcium, and then they help in the proper functioning of muscles and nerves, we know with sodium and potassium. All right, so that's the plasma. What about the blood cells? Well, I don't know about everybody's favorite. One of my favorites are the red blood cells, which are erythrocytes. Their main job is to transport oxygen in hemoglobin. It's such an important job that basically everything else gets removed from the cell, and it's just a whole bunch of hemoglobin in the red blood cell. And then the hemoglobin transports oxygen, and it makes it red, and it is made in the red blood cells, we know, going back to the skeletal system unit, are made in the bone marrow. Then we have our white blood cells, which are called leukocytes, and they are important for your immune system. So they protect against infection by destroying bacteria and viruses that enter the body. They are also made in the bone marrow, and then many of them are stored in your lymph nodes. And there are lots of types. If you look on page 292 and 293, you can see many of them. And finally, we have our platelets or thrombocytes, and these are actually cell fragments, and they are necessary for blood clotting. And there's a nice picture on page 294 and 295. We're going to finish up the cardiovascular system in our next video, where we learn about blood types and blood disorders. All right, see you then.